Open up your Bibles to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 1, or if you brought the story with you, you can turn to chapter 4 of the story. We are in the story chapter 4 today, and the story chapter 4 covers Exodus chapters 1 through 18. The title of this morning's message is God to the Rescue. God to the Rescue. That is the theme of what today we're getting ready to study. Question, have you ever needed rescuing? You ever been in trouble where you needed someone to kind of come and intervene and do for you what you could not do for yourself? My most recent illustration of this happened over this past winter. I was in Quincy. I had stopped at the Dollar General on 12th Street, North 12th Street, getting ready to head home and forgot I had to pick up a couple things, so stopped in there to do that. Ran into the store, came back out, realized my keys were locked in the car. Did I tell you that I left my car running? It was winter, it was cold, man, it was brutal. I thought, I'm just going to be real quick, in and out, do that. And I don't even know how my van got locked. It's a 1995 minivan. It's not like there's anything in there worth stealing, you know? So I don't even know how it got locked because I never lock it. And anyway, so I had to do the walk of shame back into the Dollar General and be like, I locked my keys in my car. Do you have a number to a locksmith? And got the locksmith. Luckily, I had my cell phone with me. Called the locksmith, and locksmith said, yeah, I'll be there in about 10 minutes. What car is it? I said, it's the one that's running. And so long story short, he came. Probably took him like 3 minutes tops to figure out which thing to put in there and unlock it. Charged me $60, and I would have gladly paid $120. You know what I mean? But we all have had situations or moments in our lives where we've needed somebody to kind of come in and do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Well, as chapter 4 of the story picks up, as chapter 1 of Exodus begins, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing God's nation, His kingdom, His favored people. They're in trouble. They're in turmoil. Where are they? Well, they're in Egypt, but they're slaves, and they're being brutally mistreated. Well, how did that all happen? Well, let's take a quick review of where we've been so far in the story. So God started this nation, this kingdom, with a man by the name of Abraham. And God told Abraham and Sarah that in their old age that they would have a son named Isaac. And so they do. And Isaac has twin boys, Jacob and Esau. But the line of promised kingdom goes through Jacob. And what we talked about last week was that Jacob had 12 sons. But his favorite was Joseph. Absolutely right. Thank you. Joseph. And that caused great jealousy among him and his brothers. And so through a series of events, Joseph finds himself a slave in Egypt because his brothers sold him into slavery. But that's not where his story ended. Because God is in control and because God has a plan for Joseph, by the way, God has a plan for your life and He's in control. And so trust Him this morning with wherever you find yourself at. But eventually what happens to Joseph is he goes from being a slave in Egypt to the second in command in Egypt, right under Pharaoh. And why was that? Well, that was because Joseph, so he could oversee the storing of grain. Remember, there was going to be 7 years of bumper crops, plentiful crops to be had, and then 7 years of drought were to follow. And so Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of all this to kind of distribute the grain, to make sure we're saving enough grain, and so that we can distribute that in our time of famine. So during the 7 years of famine, Joseph's brothers, the famine was so bad that Joseph's brothers leave their homeland and show up in Egypt wanting to buy some grain. Joseph finally reveals his identity to his brothers because they didn't recognize him, and he invites them to move to Egypt with him, and where they will be well taken care of. And so they do, and they are. They are well taken care of, they are provided for, and they prosper, and they multiply. Well, our story picks up today in Exodus chapter 1. That's page 43 in your book. And I just want to read verses 5 through 14 of Exodus chapter 1. And verse 5 is really, really important, so pay attention to it. It says, all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number. But Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all of his brothers and all that generation died. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty in number, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Verse 9. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more mightier than we are. Come, let us deal wisely with them. Let us deal shrewdly and harshly with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event a war breaks out, they will also join themselves to those who hate us. And they will fight against us, and they will depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities of Pithom and Ramses. So what are storage cities? Well, it's kind of what you might expect storage cities to be. They were specific cities that were created that were designed to store the excess grain and the excess wealth of the nation of Egypt. And these were not uncommon. King Solomon, he built storage cities during his reign as king of Israel. But Pharaoh was not satisfied with them simply building these storage cities. That's not where it ended for them. Look at verse 12. "But the more that the Egyptians afflicted them, the more the Israelites multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that the Egyptians were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and with all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them." Hey, anybody else think that the pyramids in Egypt are pretty cool? Yeah, those are really cool, aren't they? I mean, it's pretty neat. Well, you can thank the Israelite slaves. I mean, they were there in Egypt for 400 years is what the scriptures record, that they were slaves in Egypt. And Pharaoh's like, you know what? They did such a good job building these storage cities for me. We're going to put them to work even more. And we're going to treat them even more shrewdly. But even with all the persecution and the poor treatment that the Egyptians dished out on the sons of Israel, the Israelites still prospered. They kept increasing in number for those 400 years that they were slaves. And so Pharaoh does something drastic. He decides to kill all the sons who are going to be born to the Israelite women. Exodus chapter 1 verse 22 says, "Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, saying, Every son who is born you're to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive." But thankfully, not everyone obeyed Pharaoh's orders. Enter Moses. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. "Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket and she covered it with tar and pitch, and then she put the child into it, and she set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And what happens to this child? Well, Pharaoh's daughter ends up going out and she's bathing in the Nile, and she finds this child and she adopts him as her own, and she gives him the name Moses. Moses grows up with the Egyptian privileges. He's given special treatment being Pharaoh's daughter, but at heart he is still a Hebrew. He's still an Israelite, and he knew this. This was no secret to anybody. Well, one day, as Moses got older, Moses sees an Egyptian, and he's beating the tar out of this Israelite slave, and that bothers Moses. He's like, those are my people that he's mistreating, that he's abusing. So Moses looks around, doesn't see anybody, and he kills the Egyptian officer who is beating on this Hebrew slave. Moses thought he got away with it, but Pharaoh finds out that Moses has killed a man, and so Moses has to run for his life. Does anybody know where Moses runs to? Where does he run to? Midian, right? The land of Midian is where he runs to. So here we have over here, Egypt's over here in this left, right? Moses goes from Egypt all the way over to Midian. That's going to be significant, and I'm going to tell you why here in just a little bit, okay? In Exodus chapter 2, we learn that Moses ends up working for a guy by the name of Jethro. Moses worked tending his sheep. Moses ends up marrying one of Jethro's daughters. Jethro's daughter's name was Zipporah. And so for 40 years, life is, well, pretty good for him. One day, Moses is out tending his father-in-law's sheep, and he notices a strange sight. He notices off in the distance this bush, and that's not unusual, but what was unusual was that it was on fire. And even that wasn't so unusual, but what was even more unusual than a bush being on fire was that this bush was not burning up, and this fire was not spreading to all the other bushes around. And so Moses gets his curiosity piqued, and he walks over to the bush. It turns out God is in the bush. Now, here's where I was going to pause and make a little joke. Remember, what's the old saying? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? Well, I was going to say something to the effect of, well, one God in the bush is better than 100 gods in the hand, but I'll skip that joke for you today. And so God has a mission for Moses, right? And so what I love about the story of Moses is that you get this truth revealed. Here's the truth. God's power to rescue is revealed in the life and story of Moses. And in three ways, God's power is revealed. He's going to make certain that everyone knows that He, God, Jehovah Jireh, is the God who's in control of everything. And so let's first talk about how God's power is revealed in His plan. Remember way back in chapter 1 of the story when we were learning about the creation that God made in 6 days. He created everything that we see in 6 literal days. And remember when I told you that God is a God of order, that He plans things out and that He organizes chaos. He organizes things out of chaos. That's exactly how He is. And God is a planner, okay? His plans are awesome because God knows everything that there is to know. He knows what will happen and when it will happen and why it will happen and how it will happen. Think about this just for a moment. The God that you and I serve never needs to ask a question. He doesn't need to end any of His sentences with a question mark. Why? Because He knows absolutely everything. And God's plan demonstrates His power to save, especially when you stop and when you consider who it is that God is going to use to bring His plans to fruition. So back to our text, God appears to Moses, and I call Moses also known as Mr. Excuse Maker. So God is there, and He's in the form of this burning bush, and He's telling Moses His plans. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 10, He says this, "Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." You see, God wants Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, to bring them into freedom. But Moses comes up with like a bajillion reasons why that's just not going to work. And so he offers the first excuse up. He says, I'm just not good enough, God. Verse 11, he says, "But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? I'm a nobody, God." And maybe you this morning are in the same position. Maybe God, you feel and believe that He's leading you to something bigger beyond yourself to do for Him. And you're like, God, I cannot possibly handle this. I'm a nobody. Get somebody else. Well, pay attention to God's response to Moses in verse 12. He says, "Hey Moses, certainly I will be with you." And that's a good thing for maybe you to hear this morning as well. I will be with you. Here's the second excuse that Moses gave to God. Well, who do I say sent me, God? And that's a good question. Look at verse 13. "Then Moses said to God, Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me. Now they will say to me, well, what is His name? What shall I say to them then, God?" And that's a good question because you understand, don't you, that the Egyptians were a multi-theistic culture. That means they worshiped several gods. In fact, history's a little bit torn on exactly how many gods ancient Egypt worshipped. Some say as little as 64 gods, and as many as 289 gods have been cited as being worshipped by the Egyptians. And so think about it, for 400 years, these Israelites have known nothing but what the Egyptians told them about religion and about false gods. And so Moses wanted to know what to call God. You know, the one real God. And his answer is brilliant. In verse 14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And He said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you." We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Here's the third excuse that Moses offers up. What if they think I'm crazy? Verse 1 of chapter 4 of Exodus, Moses says, what if they do not believe me or listen to what I say to them? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. So God gives Moses 3 signs to validate the message, to prove that, yeah, I have had this encounter with God. The first one was this: hey, that staff you're holding, throw it down. So Moses throws it down, and it becomes a snake. And Moses freaks out and he runs away from it because apparently he doesn't like snakes all that well. God tells him, now go pick it back up. And he picks it up by the tail and it becomes a staff. That's the first sign God gives to him. The second sign that God gives to him is, hey, take your hand, put it inside your cloak, pull it out, turns white, it's leprous, it's diseased, it's sick. Now put it back into your cloak and pull it out. Wow, it's healed. That's the second sign you're to give. Here's the third sign. Take a cup or a jar of water from the Nile and pour it out on the dry ground. It becomes blood. So God gave him 3 signs, if you will, to validate that he had this encounter with the God, okay? With the God. But Moses comes up with one last excuse. Exodus chapter 4, verse 10, he says, I just don't have the skill. Then Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And God's like, you know what? I know who you are. I created you. I know what I'm asking you to do. But if it makes you feel better, take your brother Aaron along with you. So God's power was demonstrated by using Moses to bring about his plan, because Moses himself said, I'm a nobody. And apart from God's power in him, he's exactly right. He was just a pretty ordinary, common guy. Here's the second part of God's plan that would demonstrate God's power to save, and that is found in the plagues. You see, God tells Moses about his plans to bring about the plagues on Pharaoh. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, God says this, but I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. Hey parents, have you ever had to give some compulsion to your kids to do what you want them to do? That's what God's saying here. I know he's not going to let you go except under my compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and I will strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. How many plagues were there? 10 plagues, right? Well, here's the 10 plagues that were mentioned: water to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the final one, the one that finally lets Pharaoh let the Israelites go, the death of the firstborn. It was the worst one of all. But God had some specific instructions for the Israelites who were living in and amongst the Egyptians. He told the Israelites to take a lamb, to kill it, to eat it, and then he told them to take the blood of that lamb and to paint it around the door frames of their houses. Why would he tell them that? Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 through 13. God says, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Side note, did you know that each one of those plagues that God had delivered upon the nation of Egypt was a direct assault on a particular god that they worshipped? Did you know that? Verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live, that when I see the blood, I will pass over that house, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike down the land of Egypt. And so that is how the feast of the Passover came into being. The Passover feast was so that every Israelite from that moment on would forever remember God's grace, God's power, and God's provision that night in Egypt. And so they were to celebrate this feast of the Passover once a year to remember what God had done for them. So after this last plague, Pharaoh allows the Israelites to finally leave Egypt. And in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, we're told that there were over 600,000 Israelite men. That didn't include the women, and that didn't include the children. So it's pretty safe to assume that there are well over 1 million people walking out of Egypt on foot. But do you see God's plan? The plagues, all a part of God's plan. Using Moses, all a part of God's plan. And so 1 million plus Israelites are freed and they leave Egypt on foot. But Pharaoh once again has a change in heart. He's so fickle. And he decides, well, no, now I don't want the Israelites to leave. And so he goes after them and he chases them down. Verse 10 of Exodus 14. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. Now listen to just the complaints and the whines of the sons of Israel. They cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Wow, you talk about short-sighted vision. You talk about not understanding God's purpose for your life. Boy, that's the Israelites at this time. And listen to Moses' response to the people in Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, and I love it. Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. And that's a good word. Maybe somebody here today needs to hear that truth spoken into your life. Be still. Stop striving. Stop trying to fix it on your own. Stop fretting over the solution. Stop staying awake at night worrying about it. Be still and know that I am God. And watch as God performs salvation. He's going to do for you what you cannot do for yourself. And that's really the message of salvation in a nutshell. God doing for us what we couldn't possibly do for ourselves. I mean, we come now to what I love, the best part of the story. And that is God's power demonstrated in the Red Sea crossing. So with nowhere to go, they've come to the edge of the shore of the Red Sea, and the Egyptian armies are closing in behind them. God demonstrates his might once again by dividing the Red Sea and allowing the Israelites to walk across on dry ground. When the Egyptian army tried to follow after them, the Red Sea returned to normal, and the Egyptian army drowned in the sea. Exodus chapter 14, verses 30 through 31. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And that's the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt and crossing over the Red Sea. But that sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that just a made-up fable that Christians cling to make us feel good about ourselves and make us feel good about God's power? Isn't that just a made-up story? Absolutely not. Well, where's the evidence for all this, Mark? Well, let's first talk a little bit about the tradition. Tradition says that this is the route that the Egyptians took when the Israelites took when they exited Egypt. Over here, they were in Egypt. The red line flows down, and see right up here, this is where tradition says they crossed the Red Sea, right up here. And then they traveled down, and they came to Mount Sinai, okay? There's a problem with that, though. There's no evidence that over 1 million people ever even occupied that territory. And as again, tradition also says that is where the traditional Mount Sinai is down there at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, right? That's where tradition says. That's how that peninsula got its name, after the mountain. Well, tradition is wrong on that as well. Remember, where did Moses escape to after killing the Egyptian? Where did he flee and run to, trying to get away from Pharaoh? Midian, right? Oh yeah, Midian. So it would make sense then that if this is where Moses fled to get away from the hand of Pharaoh, and this is where God spoke to him in the land of Midian, his father-in-law's land where he was tending sheep, and where God said, you're going to come back to this land and you're going to worship on this mountain, wouldn't it make sense to look for the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, in that area? And it turns out some archaeologists did just that. If you were here about 6 years ago, my dad came and did a presentation called The Mountain of God. And some of this material I'm getting ready to share with you came from that presentation. But there is archaeological evidence to show that, in fact, that is where Mount Sinai is. That Mount Sinai actually is, it's called a different mountain because it's got a different name now, but Jabal el-Lawz, that's where Mount Sinai is. And it also has been shown that the Exodus now has been taken across from over here. They come down here, they wind through, the Wadi is what it's called in the Sinai Peninsula. They get right here to where the edge, or they're right up against the Gulf of Aqaba, and that's where God divides the Red Sea for them. So here, there's an oversight picture of it, so you can kind of get in your mind, oh no, the Israelites are fleeing, they've gone through this wadi here, they get to here, there's a dead end, the Egyptians are closing in from behind them, they have nowhere to go, nowhere to be, and they're like, oh, we're in big trouble. And all of a sudden, that's right there. Let's go back to the other slide, one slide. That's where God divided the Red Sea and where they crossed across here, okay? Let's go ahead 2 slides. Let me show you some things they found at the bottom of the Red Sea in that Gulf. You guys make that out right there? This is a chariot wheel that has 4 spokes with a hub in the middle. You can faintly see it. Okay? Found at the bottom of the Red Sea. And they didn't just find one of those. They found a lot of these. There were 4 spoked wheels, and there were 6 spoked wheels of Egyptian chariots they found at the bottom of the Red Sea in this location. Not only that, but they also found some horse bones, fossilized, of course, and underneath because of the salt erosion and things. In the top picture, and a horse skull. The top picture on the left is the fossilized bone. The one on the right is the normal bone. Same thing on the bottom. The one on the right is the fossilized bone, and the one on the left is a normal horse bone. Also, a horse skull. They found that at the bottom of the Red Sea. Now, let me ask you, how did that get there? It got there because God's powerful. That's how it got there. And the Bible's true. That's how it got there. Now, the Bible's true whether or not we found any of this evidence anyway, but isn't it kind of nice to know that there is evidence out there to suggest that exactly what happened in the Bible did happen? That's awesome. So God's power is revealed in all of his plan to save the Israelites. The 10 plagues, the dividing of the Red Sea, using a flawed man, all of it, it all points to God's power. Here's the second way that God's power is revealed. God's power is revealed in his name. God told Moses to tell anyone who asks who sent him to say, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. It's the Hebrew word Yahweh, and it means self-existent one. It's a name that has no beginning. It's a name that has no end. It's a name that is always in the present tense. It is the name of absolute power and yet absolute love and grace. It's a name that is dependable and faithful and true, and a name that desires the full trust of his people. In fact, it's the name that Jesus claimed as his own. In John chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. God always was, God always is, God always will be. That's power, and it was demonstrated in his name. And finally, God's power to save was revealed in the parallels of Moses' story and ours. There's a lot of parallels. There's a lot of correlation that we can gain and grasp from Moses' story into ours. First of all, Moses was used by God even though he was flawed. Moses was a murderer, and yet God used him. Moses wasn't skilled. He didn't have all the skills perfected yet, and yet God equipped him. And aren't you glad that God uses flawed people to bring about his plan? Moses was also unsure about God's plans. He was really hesitant to follow after God. He's like, I don't know about this, God. And does that ever describe you and where you're at? Maybe you can come up with a bajillion reasons why you shouldn't be following after God and doing what God is asking you to do. And yet, he went. And because he went, he saw some miraculous things. And the third parallel I want to make between Moses' story and ours is this, that Moses' excuses and our excuses are the same when it comes to freeing God's people. You see, Moses was commissioned by God to go and to bring his people out of slavery in Egypt. But did you know that you and I are commissioned by God to go bring God's children, his loved ones, out of slavery once again? Because the problem that they have is being slaves to sin. And so we are God's ambassadors to try to bring them, to try to rescue them, to try to free them from the bondage of sin through the saving message of Jesus Christ. And I notice a correlation a lot of times we are really hesitant to go free people, to go evangelize people, to go tell them the good news of Jesus. And our excuses are a lot similar to Moses. I'm just not good enough. God, I can't go tell them about Jesus. I'd be known as a hypocrite. My life isn't perfect. They'll look into my life and say, well, why should I listen to you? Or maybe they'll be like, well, who do I say sent me? In our culture, we worship a lot of gods today: money, power, sex. And people are worshiping those things. And they want to know, what can your God do for me? Why should I submit my life to his? And then we also think, well, what if they think I'm crazy? God, I have a reputation to uphold. And if I go off there and tell them they need Jesus and that they should worship him, they're going to think I'm nuts. And then finally, we also convince ourselves, I just don't have the skill. I don't know the right words to say. I don't know enough about the Bible. And so our reasons and our excuses become very similar to Moses when we're told to go and rescue those who are slaves to sin. I want to make one final parallel. When God told the people to paint the door frames of their homes with lamb's blood, and upon doing so, that God would pass over their homes, God was a foreshadowing of what was to come. You see, God told the Israelites to take a lamb, an unblemished lamb, a perfect lamb, to kill it, to slaughter it, and they were to take some bread, unleavened bread, for they had no time to let the dough rise, and they were to eat the unleavened bread and the lamb at twilight. And they were to take some of the lamb's blood, and they were to smear it on the doorposts, the frames, believing that God would pass over every house that had the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. And that blood would be that which freed the Israelites from death. And 1,500 years later, John the Baptist, upon seeing Jesus, he cried out, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And so Jesus became our sacrificial lamb, our perfect, unblemished, sinless Son of God. He was arrested and he was tried and brought before Pilate, and he was crucified at twilight. And on that cruel cross of Calvary, he shed his blood for us. And it's through that blood that we are freed. Here's the way that Paul put it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. Paul says, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." You see, what you need to understand this morning is that you need the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of your heart. It's not something that you can work for. It's not something that you can pay with Visa and earn. You need to submit your life to Christ's authority and his kingship by surrendering to him at the waters of baptism.